Another long day of hard work. Now I can get home and play a game to relax. I'm tired of losing in this game. What could go wrong if I use a few cheats? Nothing. Just getting thrown into the game world. Being cursed by a crazy goddess who gives me supernatural powers. Being hunted by thieves who kill me in the end. Facing wild monsters. And on top of that, meeting dangerous women. And so begins this story of hardships. This story begins with a young man running through the snow while reflecting on his life. That man was being chased in the midst of his escape. Compared his existence to an egg. He made that comparison at the exact moment his foot was struck by an arrow. It was then that he likened himself to a boiled egg. Right after being hit in the heel, he fell face first into the frozen ground. He himself didn't fully understand the meaning of those words echoing in his mind. However, the end seemed near as the hunter pressed a blade against his neck. The protagonist knew that in front of that enemy, there was no point in resisting. He was completely at their mercy. After the man ordered an inspection of his belongings, they found an ancient relic in his possession. Even seeing that the young man was unable to flee as he was seriously wounded, those men still kept him detained. The hunter, however, was not satisfied with mere plunder. He also wanted to take his life. Even after being dismembered, the protagonist still whispered, asking the mother of corruption not to be angered. As he murmured words to that hand, it slowly crawled toward his body, and upon reaching him, it grabbed him tightly, still repeating words in a whispering tone. It was determined to make him eliminate those people. She was the deity that dwelled within him. Amid that unsettling scene, the protagonist held his own head by the hair as he spoke. He said he had already absorbed the contents of the relic. He spoke those words as he reattached his head to his body. That was why he had that hand which followed him everywhere. As he held it, it climbed up his body, and worst of all, he had lost money. The protagonist revealed that when he turned 30, his life changed drastically. Now he was tired and too busy to play. He only remembered buying a game, but couldn't recall the name or why he had bought it. He just kept playing as the Priest of Corruption. He explained that the Priest of Corruption was a complicated character, hard to play. His performance was poor, but there was nothing he could do. His heart would always race upon entering that world. He reported that after acquiring all the materials, evolutions, and completing all class missions, he was startled by the computer screen as he suddenly found himself transformed into the Priest of Corruption. Soon after, a portal mysteriously opened, and he was sucked in, literally entering the game. Back in the present, in that snowy landscape, the sacred Hand held him. Her presence was unmistakable. According to the game's description, the Priest of Corruption was a human genetically modified by drugs. As he walked through the snow, he reflected that this had granted him extraordinary physical abilities. His senses were heightened, and his body could only be destroyed by a deity. At times, he thought there might be something wrong with his mind. Upon seeing an animal tearing apart its prey, he realized he could never stand the liquid of life. Grotesque scenes like that no longer affected him. However, his greatest problem was that his body no longer felt anything, not even the taste of food. At another point, after some time, he was finally about to obtain his priest identity. As soon as he got that identity, he went to look for a job at a guild. While he waited at the counter, the attendant informed him that she would perform a verification. After handling some papers, he remained still waiting. He pretended to be a member of the Order of Preservation because if he belonged to another order, they might become suspicious. He would be marked with a seal that only members of that order could see, the Seal of Punishment. However, the goddess he served was lenient when it came to disguises. Besides, the Order of Corruption was the enemy of all others, which would make him a target of widespread hatred, and there was also the fact that he was the only living follower of the Mother of Corruption. After ending his thoughts about the disguise, the young attendant offered him a job. She said she was pleased to be able to work with him. When she noticed that the protagonist could read and understand all the written terms, she was impressed as most asked her to read them aloud. For him, though, that was not difficult since entering the game. He had already mastered the basics. After reading through, he was left with a single question. Before setting out to complete the mission, he received half of the reward. While the young woman explained the reasons, the protagonist silently conversed with his inner goddess. After listening for a while, he stepped outside while the hand still tried to squeeze him. During the struggle, he was surprised by someone calling him Father Marn. He was a chubby-faced young man with a pompadour hairstyle and a friendly appearance. As the protagonist listened to him, the only thing he truly understood was his name. Following the young man named Pierre, he talked about monsters and ghosts. Another man appeared, calling for Pierre. This one had a scar on his face and a stern look. Pierre apologized to the protagonist, saying he needed to go on ahead. Left behind, the priest was still dealing with the hand that insisted on eliminating everyone around. He He told the goddess he needed coins to survive the winter. After that, the hand calmed down and he noticed its silence. Placing his hand over his chest where it resided, he asked her not to be sad. But no matter what he said, she always wanted someone eliminated. The protagonist, however, shifted focus, asking about the judgment of those individuals. They had their own way of communicating. She used her fingers to signal numbers. He knew that by eliminating everyone and sending them to the mother of corruption, he could receive divinity. Divinity was granted according to the number of fingers she showed for each soul's worth. He needed to collect 10,000 divinity to gain an authority. Thanks to the system, he could absorb divinity from sacred relics and thus obtain divine authority. There were 12 relics in total, and the mother of corruption had promised that if he collected them all, his wish would be granted. Surely, he would ask for the return of his sense of taste, as he deeply missed savoring anything with flavor. While thinking about that, Pierre returned, saying the captain had ordered not to disturb him. He faithfully repeated the superior's words. The priest was not to be bothered. The protagonist, as kind as ever, replied that it was all right and that there was no need to worry. Still, he kept a close watch on everyone and noticed something strange was happening. Suddenly, they were all caught in an ambush, with arrows fired from multiple directions. With a swift movement, the protagonist pulled Pierre to protect him. He threw the young man aside, keeping him from being hit by the rain of arrows. However, the projectiles kept coming and several struck the protagonist's body in multiple spots. Pierre watched in shock as the priest was severely hit. The ambushers fired more arrows, closely observing the effects. After falling to the ground, struck repeatedly, the priest lay motionless. He imagined they might be bandits while the hand begged him to kill them all. He knew the mother of corruption wanted him to pretend to be dead in order to absorb everyone's divinity. He considered this the hardest task of all. Rising up, he told the goddess she already knew who he truly was inside. After that, he stood up fully and spotted a sword nearby. With the weapon in hand, he declared to the goddess that he would never do things her way. And as he said that, he was already assuming a combat stance, gripping the sword firmly. It was then that he lunged forward, sword in hand, to fight in his own way. Meanwhile, the enemies lying in ambush couldn't understand why that man was coming toward them. He quickly closed in and began cutting them down without hesitation. The others, seeing the first one get struck, immediately grew alert toward the man, realizing he wouldn't stop for anything. The blond man with a scar gritted his teeth. He ordered everyone to lead the priest to him and after dealing with the others to join the fight. The protagonist watched as the enemy approached with determination. Soon the two exchanged sword strikes with growing intensity. The blonde-scarred man stared at the priest with a wide smile on his lips. Meanwhile, the protagonist stared back intently, gripping his sword with conviction. The fight went on with increasingly brutal blows between the two. At one point, both stepped back, observing each other closely. The protagonist noticed that the goddess's hand was beginning to assess the enemy before him. The blond man, with a crazed look, wanted to know who the priest was talking to. Once again, the two clashed swords fiercely. The tall blonde enemy believed he could easily defeat the priest, but the battle was surprisingly even. As soon as the goddess's hand completed its analysis, it revealed to the priest that the man before him had a value of 2.5. The protagonist couldn't understand how a mere mercenary had reached the level of a forest guard. Smiling, he thought to himself that this game was completely unbalanced. Even so, he resumed his offensive stance. The enemy quickly advanced, striking with force and cutting through the priest's sword, which fell into the snow. Now the blonde enemy, smiling, believed he had won by destroying the priest's weapon. As the protagonist examined the damage to his sword, the enemy remarked that this was why he preferred stainless steel. He also said there was nothing special about that priest. The blonde added that this would be his last job before leaving that place forever. The protagonist then dropped the remaining part of his sword into the snow and said he could try something different. It was better to end that matter there while they were both still smiling. However, the protagonist wanted to make an offer. He asked the enemy to leave that life behind and walk away. With a serene face, the protagonist stated that if he agreed, he would go easy in the fight. The man before him didn't believe that priest was being serious. They weren't just going to accept it and walk away. While the protagonist smiled, he was struck by an arrow. The blond man turned around and, seeing his allies, said he thought they wouldn't arrive in time. As the protagonist fell lying in the snow, the enemy held his sword and talked with his comrades about eliminating everyone. Soon after, they were startled by a voice asking if they had really eliminated everyone. Lifting his head slowly, the protagonist wanted to know why they were so surprised. The blond man watched in disbelief as the man who had taken an arrow to the head rose before them. Standing in the snow, Mocking the situation, the protagonist said someone had survived after all, holding and breaking with his bare hands the arrow embedded in his head. He said it was probably the first time they'd seen something like that. Now before him, everyone stood in shock, and the blond man began to sweat nervously. The protagonist clasped his hands together and declared that he had already given them a chance. But in return, he got an arrow to the head. Upon hearing that, the blond enemy widened his blue eyes. He ordered them to shoot that man again. Even seeing the green aura surrounding him, the archers began firing arrows once more. As he was struck, the protagonist offered reverence to the mother of corruption. Even under attack, he prayed to his goddess while the enemies could hardly believe he was still standing. As his prayer continued, the enemies tried to flee under orders from their leader. However, an invisible force prevented them from moving further away from that place. The protagonist knew his prayers had been heard. That was the barrier separating the living from divine presence, an authority that a priest of corruption needed to activate before unleashing his true power. That barrier prevented enemies from escaping or hiding from the divinity of corruption. Now, their leader realized there was no other choice but to draw their weapons. Their only chance was to try and break through the barrier. But when they looked behind, they felt a sinister energy. All of them screamed for the captain. A monster with a lizard-like appearance appeared, walking toward them. It was something immense, incredibly powerful. Everyone wondered what that creature was. The giant monster attacked, breaking the ground near them. With wide eyes, they now knew they were facing a true monster. It opened its mouth and unleashed a deafening, maddening roar. Desperate, they all tried to escape the limits of the barrier. Warriors who had once acted brave were now crying in fear, terrified for their lives. Meanwhile, the protagonist just smiled as he listened to his enemies begging for mercy. After some time, footsteps on the snow showed that the protagonist had eliminated them all. After the confrontation, he wondered if he should collect the divinities. He wanted to know if by collecting them from their bodies, they wouldn't vanish. Now, he tried to think of a plan. He couldn't be careless as the guild might investigate. On the ground, he found Pierre fallen after being struck by an arrow. The protagonist decided to end all that and let Pierre rest in peace. He would do his best to save that man's life and thus improve his own reputation. Once more, he asked his goddess for help. After some time, someone was seen holding a chalice. A woman asked what had happened to the individual who had stolen the relic. She was told that the person had been eliminated on the spot. Upon hearing that the head had been separated from the body, she wanted to know what happened to the remains. When the priest turned his back, a young man called for his attention. Looking at the chalice, he warned that it could return. From that point on, the priest considered setting out on a pilgrimage. Upon hearing that, the servant thought the decision was quite sudden. He asked if it had to do with the prophecy. The blue-haired priest's answer was yes. It was exactly because of the prophecy. Besides that, there was someone he needed to find. As he walked through the snow carrying Pierre in his arms, it was narrated that 10 years ago, all religious orders had received a prophecy. The end would with a shell of life and fall upon the world. As they saw the priest approaching with Pierre, the guards came to meet him. The protagonist was surprised by someone calling out to him, saying he had just returned. While the guards carried Pierre inside, a red-haired young woman announced that she had already received permission to pass. During the conversation, she told the protagonist that she never would have imagined, judging by his appearance, that he was so strong. Hearing that, he felt a bit awkward, but only looked at her when she mentioned that she knew what he was carrying in a sack. She claimed that was the source of all the problems. She thought it would be better if instead of carrying it around, he left it with the guild. While they walked through the city, the young woman asked if he had a place to sleep. She said that if he didn't, he could stay at her house. The young man simply looked at her slightly blushing, while his deity, enraged, wanted to eliminate her. Despite the goddess being against it, the young man ended up accepting the invitation of the beautiful redhead. And now he found himself lying down with the goddess's hand resting on his chest. Looking upward with a friendly face, he thought he had simply accepted the invitation of a lovely lady. But a sound coming from the door caught his attention, making him look in that direction. It was the redhead standing at the door, greeting the priest. With the door only slightly open, she said she wanted to let him rest. He put on his slippers and heard her say she needed him to pay attention to something. Standing before the girl who was still at the door, he asked what the problem was. After she said that the Lord wanted to see him, he made a surprised face. As the young woman remained at the door, he asked if she knew why. While she explained, far from there, a well-kept mansion could be seen. Inside, someone was having tea while the butler explained that the priest had arrived. Floor simply asked the butler to leave, and he lowered his head, respectfully obeying the order. Lord Giz was a man with black hair and a black beard who watched the priest with a strange gaze. The protagonist noticed when the Lord asked if he had witnessed his brother's final moments. And when the Lord offered the protagonist tea, he simply gave a wicked smile. He remembered when the mother of corruption saw the Lord for the first time. She had drawn an X. Because of that, he already knew that man wasn't human and decided to confront him. The demon, realizing that the priest knew exactly who he was, had his eyes turned red. That was how the two of them communicated. When she marked someone with an X, it meant that person wasn't human. In that land, there were many demons disguised as humans to live among them. Although demons were stronger than any other being, some of them did nothing on their own. To become part of that world, they had no choice but to make pacts with the existences. And that was why demons liked humans so much. However, the gods hated the demons because they gave as much as they took from their servants. As a result, the gods declared that not only the demons, but all their followers would be called demons. These existences were considered evil, and that was how the demon hunt by the priest began. The protagonist, closing his eyes, reflected on this, since demon contractors were a difficult class, and people usually avoided them. But he remembered why he chose to play that class. Now, in the office of that lord, the two remained silent until the lord said, "Wow," seeming excited. Remembering his brother, he said it was thanks to the deceased that the priest now stood before him. With a teacup in hand, the lord admired how the priest managed to see through the disguise. With a wicked look and fingers interlocked, the demon said he could be called sneaky. However, the protagonist closed his eyes and told the man that he was a priest serving the mother of corruption. That information left the demon intrigued, as he believed that deity no longer had any followers. Excited, he asked the guest to take a seat since they were the only ones in that place. He said he wanted to be honest and revealed that he hadn't invited him there by chance. As the man spoke, the protagonist noticed that he remained seated calmly. The Lord wanted to know about the captain of the mercenary group. He wanted to know exactly how he had died. The protagonist simply listened while the Lord said he would ensure payment for his efforts. Those words seemed to please the player, who gave a slight smile. While the Lord spoke, the protagonist thought it had been an unfortunate event. Galade complained that during that winter there was no work. The Lord had tried to arrange something under the table. No one expected the young man to die in the process. Now the Lord said that this thing called life in his eyes was something very difficult. He said this while looking out the window. After the protagonist left the Lord's presence, he already had a small pouch filled with gold coins. He knew that the Lord wasn't trying to manipulate him with that money. The gold was simply a way to obtain the truth. Walking away from the castle, he stated that he wasn't a greedy priest. Quite the opposite. Seeing that the mother of corruption was angry, he held her hand and, caressing it, said he didn't want to see her upset. The hand seemed to want him to keep talking, so he brought it to his mouth and coughed. The protagonist said there was something that didn't rust and lasted just as long as gold. With a smile and blushing cheeks, he declared to that hand that it was his love for the goddess. That hand seemed touched as it began to tremble. Then the protagonist placed her hand close to his own heart, and he continued saying that to him, she would always be the most important thing. As he walked, he told her that for that reason, she didn't need to worry so much. Sometime later, he returned to the inn, and the red-haired girl was happy to see him again. She waved to the side and asked him to greet the priest from the sect of teaching. With a cheerful expression, he thought that he didn't know what that sect was doing there. However, his eyes looked in that direction. It seemed like something was wrong. The look was also returned by one of the members of the sect. The protagonist already knew. The moment he saw them, the mother had told him. One of them possessed a sacred relic. And now the protagonist was analyzing the three before him. Someone walking toward him said that it was the result of a life dedicated to justice. The protagonist just watched while the person continued, saying he never expected to see a priest of preservation. Introducing himself, he said he was the weight on the scale of retribution. He could be called Orvis. That man had a piercing gaze, shining armor, and carried a very striking weapon. He said the other, a large man with white hair, was named Corneas, and the young woman was Patina. They all greeted the priest by placing their hands on their chests. He returned the greeting in the same way, saying it was a pleasure to meet them. The red-haired girl mentioned a blonde woman who was eyeing some books in the library. The protagonist felt a certain relief, knowing there were other sects and priests present. He thought that even if not at that moment, he would have several chances to take that relic for himself. However, there was a problem. When he absorbed a relic's divinity, something always ended up going wrong. Now, he wondered whether he was truly a priest of corruption or just a villain of corruption. The priests greeted the protagonist and said they had to leave. They were going to greet the Lord. Orvis told the protagonist that they would have a serious talk the next time they met. As they left, the protagonist noticed that they all carried identical weapons and were heading to greet the Lord. The redhead told the protagonist that their guild usually provided shelter for priests at an affordable price. Sweating, he asked if she was going to make him pay for the night he spent at the end. Smiling, she asked if he thought she would let him stay there purely out of self-interest. In truth, that was what he thought, but he said no. Blushing slightly, the redhead continued, saying she had her own reasons for helping him because she always turning her hand to the side. She said she wanted him to prevent the food from spoiling. Getting closer, she asked if he could cast a preservation blessing over the food. Blushing even more, he stepped away from the girl and asked why she was whispering that. After embarrassing the priest, the girl gave a wide smile. Right after, she asked why he looked bored. Someone came through the door and guessed that the two got along well since they were joking around. The priest asked why that man hadn't gone with the others. It was Corneus, the white-haired priest. He said he had no choice because of his people. He said that from the outside, he had asked the group to show respect in his name as well. The redhead believed that Lord Triadon wouldn't care about that sort of thing. When she said that, the two looked at her, and she explained that despite the Lord seeming cold, he did a good job. She added that, of course, she knew how to separate work for personal life. She warned both of them that since there were many people who supported the Lord, they should stay quiet. The white-haired priest wanted to know more about the Lord. He seemed interested. The girl smiled as she talked about the Lord, and the priest simply observed everything. At a certain point, he also had a question and wanted the girl to reveal something to him. Smiling, he asked the other priest why he had given up on visiting the Lord. He, with a wide smile, replied that they were currently following a prophecy. They had received it 10 years ago, and now the priest believed that the end of the world was hiding. The protagonist broke into a sweat as he realized they were there because they believed the Lord was a demon. In another scene, already near the Lord, the two priests were walking to greet him when the relic began to shine. Upon seeing the glow, they knew if a sacred relic shone near someone, it meant that person was a demon. Now, with the relic in hand, they knew they had to destroy him. The demon knew he could no longer hide, so he revealed his true form. A burst of fire was noticed by both the protagonist and the other priest. A creature resembling a mutant lizard emerged from within the Lord's mansion. The priest looked in fear in that direction, but the other priest had already expected it. Inside the Lord's mansion, a priest wielded the scales of retribution, a weapon resembling a hammer. That was one of the 3 priests of wisdom who were facing the demon. During the battle, he alternated between axe and sword until he drove the blade into the top of the massive creature's head. A mix of dust, lightning, and all kinds of devastation could be seen from a distance as the priest challenged the demonic entity. The priest accompanying the protagonist explained that the glow in the sky was caused by the hammer of punishment wielded by Orvis. He said Orvis was probably fighting a demon and pointing in that direction, expressed his desire to go help him. Merrick, however, walked in the opposite direction and said the priest could go ahead catch up soon. He returned to the inn calling for the red-haired girl. Aaron, startled to see him, ran toward him, wanting to know what was going on. However, when the protagonist entered through the door with a strange expression, he only wanted to know where it was. Holding the girl in his arms, he asked where the medical center treating Pierre was. Aaron, not quite understanding the question, only watched as the priest leaped from there to a safer place. He was fleeing the rubble and destruction, acting as if he had little time. The young woman, carried by him, watched all the chaos around. People were screaming for help. In the distance, a massive reptile could be seen. The demon's current form, with the priest on top of it, wielding his hammer. The redhead screamed in terror, trying to warn the priest about the monster. The reptile, besides being gigantic, was extremely muscular and completely uncontrollable. Merrick told her to forget the monster and just say where Pierre was. Seeing the young man's concern, she pointed in the direction with her finger. The protagonist, determined to protect him, stared ahead, repeating Pierre's name in his mind. Upon entering the location, he found Pierre lying on a mattress. Almost everything around was destroyed, but the young man remained calm asleep. The protagonist looked at him and thought he couldn't let him die, especially after barely managing to save him. Despite Pierre being burly, Merrick threw him over his shoulder with ease. He then asked Aaron to climb onto his back as he could no longer carry her in his arms. The young woman, embarrassed by the closeness and hugging the priest's neck, blushed slightly. With a leap, he dashed forward at high speed. Determined to complete his mission, he ran as fast as possible. The young woman, as she was being carried, seemed deep in thought. Then she told the priest she knew a shortcut. Shouting through the wind, he asked where it was. She pointed with her finger and said it was just straight ahead in that direction. As they approached, she warned that they would have to pass through a house with a secret passage. The door was locked, but that wasn't an obstacle for Merrick, who kicked it down. Aaron, seeing the scene, was visibly embarrassed. While trying to keep balance and speed, slipping slightly on the floor, the priest kept going steadily. The The young woman thought his movements were rather rough. Looking back at the destroyed door, she muttered softly that she really thought he was very strong. He sat her down and told her that if things got worse, she should escape through the secret passage. She was confused about what he intended and why he wouldn't leave with them. Moments later, he explained that he needed to go back and help the other priests. Leaving Aaron and Pierre away from the chaos with a chance of survival, he set off once again. Aaron only watched his back as he ran and thought about how incredibly strong he was. After running for a long time, the priest reached a place, and his expression grew somber. He had arrived too late. On the ground, he found one of the priests badly wounded. It shook him deeply. He approached the burly man with white hair and a horn on his forehead. It was Corneus. Even weakened, Corneus recognized Merrick as he approached. The protagonist looked at him with sorrow, aware of the severity of the injuries. He knew there was nothing he could do. He spoke to him while he was still breathing, fearing that the end was near. The big man said his companion, Patina, had died. The priest, looking to the side, saw the young woman's body brutally thrown against a wall. He asked Cornelius if there was any other way to defeat the demon. Cornelius revealed that there was still another relic, the white sword. It was with the priest Orvis, who had managed to stab it into the demon's head. He said that if Marn took the sword and drove it directly into the creature's brain, he could defeat it. After revealing this, his eyes rolled back and his hand fell to the ground, kicking up a bit of dust. The protagonist remained by the body for a while. Then he called upon his goddess, the mother of corruption, and said he was going to collect something from that man. Meanwhile, Orvis was still fiercely fighting the demon. Using the hammer of retribution, he tried to drive the sword even deeper. However, the more he insisted, the more furious the reptile became. The creature thrashed, violently swinging its tail and limbs in all directions. From a distance, the protagonist ran with all his strength. Believing this was his only chance, he leaped and managed to stab another sword near the creature's tail. Up ahead, he spotted the priest with the sword he needed. That's when he noticed the reptile behaving strangely. This made Merrick uneasy, fearing what might happen. The reptile firmly planted its feet on the ground. As it opened its mouth wide, Marn recognized it. That was the death spin. The attack flung him far away, making him crash down violently. Almost out of strength, he told the mother of corruption that he was fine. Lying on the ground, his legs badly injured, he admitted that she was right. Blessings came with disasters. Despite the pain, there was a faint smile on his face. He felt he had succeeded. Looking to the side, he saw the relic nearby, which made him breathe a sigh of relief. With the relic in his hands, he thought this had all turned into an interesting twist. Placing the sword against his chest, he declared to the goddess of corruption that he would offer her that sacred relic. He made a request, a new authority. At that moment, a strange hand seemed to emerge from his pocket. As he handed the relic to the goddess of corruption, the protagonist asked her to release another seal. He believed that every sacred relic contained enough divinity to grant a new authority. That one in particular contained 11,723 units of divinity, and that left him satisfied as he was now surrounded by an intense green energy. The seal should be released. So, he asked the goddess what power he had obtained. She, however, simply jumped off his chest and started running, tapping her fingers hard against the ground. As she moved away, the protagonist said he'd be happy if she could support him even from that distance. He confessed he felt joy in seeing her growth. Even so, he admitted they weren't in the best situation, and for that reason, he would stop playing around. Changing his tone, he called for the mother of corruption, and thus the goddess listened. Levitating before her, he declared that he would offer another 10,000 units of divinity in exchange for a new authority. After everything was completed, he seemed more satisfied. He liked the newly acquired authority, and now beneath his feet a magic circle appeared. It was the script of corruption. The effects of that authority were simple, yet still powerful, and that made him show a curious expression. The moment the script was activated, metaphysical tattoos in dark green tones began to spread across his body, enhancing his physical abilities. He commented to the goddess that it wasn't a bad authority. He believed it could be useful in the current situation. Standing up, he brushed the dust off his clothes and announced that his legs were healed. Looking to the side, something caught his attention. It was the body of the priest Orvis, now lying on the ground, apparently lifeless. The protagonist deduced that he had been thrown by the reptile during the battle. They had likely fallen around the same time. With sorrow, he wished him to rest in peace. Even so, he decided to collect the divinity from the body, and as he approached, he made the necessary gesture. The green energy began to flow. Meanwhile, the massive reptile remained furious, its glowing red eyes shining intensely. It caused destruction with its tail and heavy steps, keeping the protagonist on alert. Something about that situation felt profoundly wrong. The priest stared at the creature, trying to understand its motivation. He knew that the ones responsible for bringing the sacred leaf to the demon were priests of the sect of knowledge. Even with all the priests dead, the demon wouldn't calm down. While reflecting, he finished absorbing the divinity. He had gained another 1,000 units. He stood still, facing the beast. He found it curious that demons didn't behave like simple beasts. Meanwhile, the divine hand slowly emerged from his pocket. He warned it that things were about to get intense and told it to hold on. The tattoos, now a metallic green, spread more intensely across his body, visible on his face and arms. Soon, the priest's face was reflected in the large reddish eye of the reptile. He charged forward at high speed, launching himself toward one of the creature's front legs. The beast tried to strike him again with its tail, causing massive destruction that made the protagonist furious to the point that the veins on his face and neck bulged. He seemed to be looking for something and found it. The white sword partially embedded in the reptile's head. Without hesitation, he ran toward it. He noticed the reptile was tilting again, preparing another attack. But this time, he wouldn't let the blow land. Even with its mouth open in a roar, the protagonist did not back down, placing his hand on the sword's hilt. He thought to himself that the same move wouldn't work on him twice. He was ready to use the beast's own movement against it. The chaos continued. Houses burned, windows shattered, and the scene grew more apocalyptic by the second. The protagonist began to cough in a worrying way. Looking at the palm of his hand, he saw that the blood was becoming more frequent. Worse still, the reptile, now with its back covered in spikes, charged toward him. He repositioned himself. He knew he had to move quickly as his body was rotting from the inside out. He thought that if the demon kept resisting, the corruption might overflow and escape his body. If that happened, he'd be doomed. Wasting no time, he leaped and grabbed the white sword tightly. He remembered what the priest had said. If he could drive it deep enough into the demon's head to reach the brain, he'd win. Gripping the hilt tightly, he pulled the sword from the creature. When he finished, he smiled. Turning around, he ordered the Lord to awaken. A brilliant light spread out, illuminating the entire area, and Lord Treen began to stir. In front of astonished eyes, a silhouette could be seen within the light. The great reptile began to disintegrate, and the glow became even more intense. The residents of the nearby districts witnessed the moment the flash took over much of the city. The light was so bright that even the red-haired girl who was far away beside Pierre noticed it. Curious, she walked to the door to confirm what she suspected. When the phenomenon ended, the Lord's body lay on the ground with visible wounds. Smiling, the protagonist asked if he was already awake. The man replied with a slight smirk. As he turned and saw him with his remaining eye, he said he was happy to see him again. The protagonist pointed at the white sword and said all of that had happened because of it. He raised his hand toward the Lord and said he owed him 2 reserve gold coins. The Lord, looking pleased, seemed to accept the deal with good humor. Leaning on Priest Marn's hand, he slowly tried to rise. After the recent events, somewhere far away, a mage was focusing power in the palm of her hand. The young woman with intense blue eyes appeared to be casting a tracking spell. After carefully manipulating the energy, she launched it in a specific direction. The flow's trajectory indicated the person being tracked had passed through there. And now she and a hooded man watched the result closely. The man, already old and with scars on his face, merely confirmed what he had already suspected. As he stared at the ground, he watched the magic bring forth a strange kind of herb. That sight always stirred old memories in him. He could hardly believe such a powerful authority was involved. But that's exactly what the magic revealed. It was up to him regretfully to accept the truth. Even without finding the bodies, he was sure he had decapitated them. He clearly remembered that day. It was colder than it was now, and although a long time had passed, the memory was still vivid. The young woman beside him agreed with the theory that the bodies could have been taken by monsters or beasts. The old man, looking at her, thanked her for bringing him there, but asked one more favor. She calmly replied that he could ask as long as he first named the nearby towns. While she quietly observed the surrounding area elsewhere, the chaos caused by the demons still spread. Among the debris, the protagonist and the Lord's butler walked together. When they reached a certain location, the butler opened the door politely for the priest to enter. Mark stepped in with a calm expression, showing tranquility. The one who seemed even happier to see him was the Lord, who opened his arms in a welcoming gesture. With a gentle smile and closed eyes, the protagonist heard the Lord say he looked more handsome every time they met. Even so, the Lord admitted he could never express all the gratitude he felt. The priest, with a slight smirk, commented that the demon was alive and breathing, and remembering that the demon himself had said all races deserve to live. He seemed to agree with the thought. After the battle with the great reptile, word spread that the priest was a demon slayer. Although that title didn't suit him, people started calling him that. The girl from Inn, Erin, also contributed to this, as she quickly became fond of the nickname. Now, wherever he went, people would comment, "That's the great demon slayer." Others would murmur, "I heard he took on 7 bandits all by himself." Some even said defeating a demon must have been easy for someone like that. This made him avoid certain places. During a conversation with the Lord, Merrick mentioned that he found his wooden prosthetic strange. That was because they moved with surprising naturalness, but the Lord explained he only did that in front of the priest. To others, he pretended to limp and claimed he couldn't control them. With a reddish gleam in his eyes, he revealed there was a price to moving them freely. The protagonist, curious, asked what that price was. The man, smiling and sipping his tea, replied that sooner or later his beautiful hair would fall out. He said he would probably end up like a tree in autumn without leaves. He joked that if they met again in a few months, the priest wouldn't recognize his locks anymore. War pretended to cry, saying that just imagining it already made him sad, and asked to change the subject. The Lord, looking into his teacup, asked if the priest had any free time. He said there was a job, and the requester had specifically asked for. He mentioned that after the demon slayer rumors spread, many people became interested in him. When he said the job involved sacred relics from the old empire, the protagonist showed interest. The reward would be 5 gold coins, plus an advance payment. If he gave his best, he might even receive one of the discovered relics. These could range from goblets to stones and other objects. He remembered what the mother of corruption had said about relics. Smiling faintly, he thought it would be best to check things out in person. He told the Lord he would accept the job. The protagonist knew that long ago there had been an empire responsible for ending the era of deranged mages. That empire had unified the continent and developed technologies still in use today. Most items considered high nowadays were actually relics from that old empire, now accompanied by his contractors. Marnak greeted them. A man named Carmen Voltis introduced himself, saying he was in charge of the mission. The name sounded familiar, and upon noticing that, Carmen explained he was the son of Anthony Valtis. Before the priest could misunderstand, he added that he was an illegitimate son. The priest, smiling, thought to himself that the Black Wolf had always been a man of principles. Even so, he had an illegitimate child, something surprising, especially after the death of his wife. He wanted to know more, but found it inappropriate to ask. Noticing other figures in the background, he asked for them to be introduced. Carmen pointed to the hooded mage and said her name was Tunisia. He then pointed to the burly man, saying he was Sukis from the Unicorn tribe. The big guy with huge hands introduced himself politely, saying it was a pleasure to meet the demon slayer. The priest, smiling, asked him to just call him Marn. Shukis replied that such an accomplishment was nothing to be ashamed of. Carmen, spreading his arms, said that now that everyone was introduced, they could continue the conversation on the road. 2 days later, they were gathered around a campfire. Carmen asked if Merrick wasn't going to sleep. The priest replied that he had already rested enough. Trying to make conversation, the young man asked if he had already found his other half. With slightly flushed cheeks, the protagonist answered that it was like fresh snow covering the field. When asked what kind of person he liked, he thought about the hand of the goddess of corruption. With his eyes closed, he said he preferred someone who would always stay by his side. The goddess who usually made her presence known remained silent this time. Carmen commented that the ideal person must have a huge heart. The goddess agreed, seemingly enjoying the direction of the conversation. Then the young man raised his arms and said, smiling that if the heart was that big, there must be plenty of room to hold him. With a wide grin, he said he liked women with a lot of space between the heart. The protagonist commented that it wasn't bad to have a clear vision of the future, but advised against making such remarks in front of women. Carmen assured him he was only saying that because he saw him as a longtime friend. Marn's smile in that moment was genuine. He felt the same way. They talked for a long time that night, while the goddess watched slightly annoyed. With his eyes closed, Marn recalled how the goddess always warned him to be selective with his friends. Even so, when he looked at Carmen, he felt that he was a good person. As they walked through the snow, the mage stopped and announced they had arrived at the place. She raised her hood slightly and stated that from that point on, the responsibility was hers. With the key in hand, she revealed that she was about to open the entrance to the ruin. Entering the ruins of the ancient empire was easy. First, they needed to find the key and then follow the coordinates written on it. In addition, they read the passage written in ancient language that was engraved on the key itself. To finally insert the key, it had to be turned clockwise or counterclockwise. That was what the mage was doing. Already placing the key in the correct slot, she turned it. Only she could do it. since mages were the only ones capable of reading the ancient language, which justified her role in the expedition. However, with a gleam in his eyes, the protagonist knew there was an exception to the rules. The players, they could also read the ancient language. Thus, the protagonist simply kept his abilities hidden. When the portal opened, everyone was ready to enter. The protagonist thought he had kept everything secret. The expedition leader, already with one hand inside the portal, looked back and invited everyone to come in. Once inside, the protagonist carefully observed the portal's interior. That ruin was huge and well preserved, although vegetation had already overtaken the walls. Cayman, as the expedition leader, was thrilled. Of all the ruins he had visited, that one was perfect. The protagonist, with the same gentle look, said he was certain they would find many artifacts there. After that, he gave a slight smirk. He thought he'd finally have the chance to see the ruin in person, something he had only seen in photos, which made his heart nearly explode with excitement. But not everyone there was kind or radiated joy like the protagonist. The mage was always sulking. With the torches lit, it was easier to identify the path. Just like the others, the unicorn man was very excited. After walking a bit, they reached the great doors where a powerful magic had been inscribed. The magic could only be released if someone among them had imperial blood, which would allow the doors to be opened safely. Looking at the mage, the protagonist heard her warn that they would need imperial blood. She, with a serious expression, said that since none of them were from the Empire, once the doors opened, it would be best if everyone was ready for a harsh battle. That's exactly what happened. As soon as she opened the doors, monsters of all kinds came out from within. Those beasts went straight for the group, intending to annihilate them. The serious man with an axe in hand was already preparing to defend himself, if necessary. And soon he charged toward the monsters to clear the path. Meanwhile, the mage continued casting spells and defending herself. She cast a spell that caused the ground to crack and emit lights through the fissurers. After that, several monsters began to fall. From the cracks, large explosions erupted, lighting up much of the area. They then exploded not only the area, but also many of the monsters. Now the protagonist saw them flying through the air. The priest also gripped his sword tightly, ready to react if any of the creatures came close. With an extremely sharp blade and gifted with incredible powers, the priest began to fight. As the protagonist and someone highly skilled, he left no monster whole wherever he passed. However, something was bothering him. He had been warned by his goddess about the corruption. A sword was coming his way, but he had enough time to block it. As he turned completely, he saw that it was a monster, and a sword was emerging from the palm of his hand. The player just stared at that monster, thinking he hadn't expected another one, but it was better to eliminate it. With that thought, he prepared himself, but something struck the monster's skull. The priest closed his eyes as an arrow passed very close to him and pierced the monster's skull. He wasn't startled, not even when the arrow passed so close, nor after the monster fell. He simply looked toward the one who had fired the arrow, the leader of that expedition. Still looking back, realizing that the leader had reacted quickly, the protagonist thanked him mentally. He heard the unicorn man getting mad at the mage because she was still pushing enemies toward them. The mage, looking in their direction, said it was the fastest way to get rid of all the enemies. She also said they shouldn't complain since they had managed to eliminate all the monsters. Still, the young man was annoyed. So much so that the once gentle unicorn man was now gritting his teeth, baring his sharp fangs. Pouting, he sat with his back turned, veins bulging on his face, and his head hanging down. Meanwhile, the protagonist received great praise from the group leader. The priest, who always showed a sweet and gentle appearance, said he was ashamed of having revealed his profane side. Thus, the player also returned the compliment to Carmen, saying the young man was very skilled with a bow and arrow. Carmen said he had always trained to keep getting better. However, not everyone was cheerful in talking. The mage wanted to know when they would move on. While she said she was ready to go back to exploring like before, the group leader and the protagonist stared at her. She stood still with her staff in hand, saying she still had plenty of mana. The young unicorn man was upset and didn't even want to hear the girl's voice. So angry that he referred to the mage as a magic mutterer, saying she was being impatient. Upon hearing that, she said everyone needed to rest a bit more and that she believed the others agreed with her. She went on to provoke Sukis, saying that to be honest, she thought he was just trying to put on a show. However, the final word belonged to the expedition leader, and he sided with the unicorn man, Sukis. Even with the mage upset, Carmen declared that the matter was settled. They would rest, and he didn't want to hear another word about it. Putting on a cheerful face, the protagonist thought all mages were full of themselves. In that world, becoming a mage was easy. It happened at birth, if one was born with the ability. Even with some variations, Those born with mana awakened it at a certain age and were then able to access their magic. When that happened, knowledge of the ancient language would flow into their minds. Thus, they gained power without having to pay for it. They learned the ancient tongue and were given a magic staff. They could tap into the mana that flowed through their veins, which allowed them to break the world's natural laws. The protagonists, looking at the mage, knew that since they were born mages, they had everything due to their vast knowledge. Most of them rejected any other way of learning new things, and just like the old mages, most became dull-minded, stubborn, rude, and grumpy. The protagonist, watching how she treated Sukkis, thought most mages were arrogant. To be honest, he felt that among all the mages, she was actually quite polite. Despite her bad temper, she spoke little, and her criticisms weren't that harsh. After some rest, the expedition leader announced it was time to move out. He said they would explore the next area, and everyone was already on their feet and ready. It was at that moment that they all heard a loud noise like a massive roar. That heady sound seemed to come from a corridor. Dust and a powerful gust of wind hit the 4 members of the group. That's when the expedition leader noticed that the doors behind them had closed. As he said this, the other 3 looked in the direction he pointed. But that wasn't all. A huge monster fell from the ceiling. It was a massive creature made of silver with something glowing on its head that emitted a blue hue. That orb on its head appeared to be the core that sustained its whole body. Looking at the creature, the protagonist smiled, thrilled. He couldn't believe it was real. He had assumed the enemies in that ruin were too weak. But now, seeing that silver monster, he was sure that was the real threat. Sukkis watched the immense monster before him, trying to maintain a firm stance. Though the sweat on his forehead betrayed his fear, despite being ready to fight, the unicorn man was caught off guard when the mage ordered him to fall back immediately. The woman stepped in front of everyone and with steady movements channeled her magical energy to the tip of her staff. Murmuring an ancient incantation, she cast her spell at the imposing silver monster that threatened the group. The mage's intention was clear: to bring down the chamber ceiling on the creature, crushing it under the weight of the rocks and ending the fight decisively. However, to everyone's surprise, absolutely nothing happened to that colossal being. From a distance, the mission leader frowned as he realized the situation was quickly spiraling out of control. He shouted as loud as he could, trying to warn Tunisia that the attack was too risky and that her magic, unfortunately, wouldn't be enough. It was too late. On the monster's forehead, an intense blue light began to shine brightly, signaling the release of a devastating power. In an instant, the monster activated its ability and crushed all the rocks hurled at it, reducing them to dust in tiny fragments. Upon witnessing the magnitude of that power, the 3 frontline members froze in fear. Soon after, burning chunks of stone began to fall from the ceiling, threatening to engulf Tunisia. Seeing the desperation on her companions' faces, she looked up and realized this would be her end. The monster was already closing in fast and took the stance of someone about to deliver a fatal blow. When it struck with its fist toward the mage, there was nothing left of her to be remembered. Even the unicorn man, who rarely showed any sympathy for Tunisia, was overcome with deep sorrow. The impact of the loss was so great that Sukkis became completely motionless, turning into a vulnerable target. The protagonist, witnessing the scene, shouted desperately for Sukkis to duck or get out of the creature's line of sight. Unfortunately, the young man couldn't hear the warnings or react in time. The monster's blow hit him directly, and a massive explosion lit up the area. Thus, the unicorn man was struck head-on with no chance to flee or defend himself. Now, the silver colossus with the blue core turned its attention to the last 2 survivors of the expedition. With a gaze that made its intentions clear, the priest turned to the expedition leader and asked if he truly wanted to stay alive. Upon hearing the affirmative answer, the protagonist clenched his fist and firmly gave the man the chance to swallow his words. The leader, confused by the priest's attitude, didn't understand what was about to happen until he was suddenly knocked out. The priest held his unconscious companion in his arms, but didn't take his eyes off the monster. He had already said that he had a powerful ally, and so he summoned the beast. The metallic being didn't understand what this new creature appearing before it was. The beast emerged with its fingers interlaced, ready to unleash a devastating strike. It struck the enemy from above with a crushing blow, making it clear that it wasn't there to play. The protagonist, with his friends slung over his shoulder, began to withdraw from the battlefield, trusting the giant to handle the rest. Looking back, he felt secure for having summoned that creature, a reliable entity in moments of greatest despair. While fleeing, he found the remains of the mage and absorbed 1,000 units of divinity. Without wasting time, he also gathered what was left of the unicorn man, obtaining another 100 units. After that, he leaned Carmen, still unconscious, against the secure wall. With a hand on his head, unsure of what to do, the young man reflected on the battle. He believed it would take time before the beast could fully defeat the enemy. At that moment, the hand of the goddess of corruption began to stir restlessly inside his pocket. With a serious expression, the protagonist remarked to it that everything was happening just as it had predicted. Unleashing his neon green tattoos, he decided he could no longer hesitate. He rushed back toward the battlefield, ready to help. His eyes were fixed on the blue core in the center of the metallic creature's head. His true objective. The jewel shimmered with a supernatural intensity as the fight between monsters continued. The priest knew that gem was the only truly distinct part of that metallic body. He concluded that destroying it would be the key to ending the threat. So he climbed onto the back of the allied beast and launched himself into the air, determined to reach the glowing core. As he approached, he noticed that the jewel reflected his movements precisely. Without hesitation, he struck with force, shattering the core into multiple fragments. His eyes still glowed green as he fell onto the ground, already ravaged by battle. With the core destroyed, the metallic monster remained paralyzed for a brief moment before collapsing. The beast sent by the goddess of corruption lifted its head and howled as if celebrating victory. The protagonist silently thanked the creature for its help. At that moment, the hand of the goddess pointed in a specific direction. The young man followed the gesture with his gaze and suspicious asked what had happened. That was when 3 more giant metallic monsters dropped from the ceiling. The protagonist's expression changed, revealing an unusual look. Now the new enemies stared directly at the beast and the priest. It was clear that neither of them was in any condition to face 3 more opponents of the same level. With a grim expression, the protagonist wondered how many more of them would appear. Leaving the battlefield behind, he returned to the expedition leader. The man waking up asked about the whereabouts of their companions. With sorrow, the protagonist informed him that unfortunately, they hadn't even had the chance to defend themselves. Carmen reflected on the moment when the giants fell from the ceiling and concluded the key should have been activated earlier. Noticing that the man was blaming himself, the priest reminded him that everyone had been hired for a reason. Recalling the unicorn man and the mage, he said both of them knew exactly the risk they were taking. The leader, intrigued, wanted to know what place exactly that was. The priest answered seriously. They were standing before the legendary Black Gate. The man widened his eyes, incredulous at the revelation. It seemed impossible, and he closed his eyes tightly, trying to process the information. Even without understanding how it could have happened, he decided not to ask questions. Instead, he swore in the name of the Valtis that he would repay the debt he owed the priest. Smiling with his usual serene face, the priest replied that he would be waiting eagerly. Now, standing in the corridor, he suggested that if his companion was feeling better, the 2 of them should keep moving as the monsters hadn't been completely defeated. He knew that after taking down a single giant with the help of the beast of corruption, others had descended from the ceiling, forcing him to retreat. Nearly out of strength, he had barely managed to open the doors ahead, needing to kick Carmen to push him into the room. Before moving on, he told the beast of corruption to return as soon as possible, as he knew she would come back shortly. As he walked, he observed the stones along the path, studying the composition of the soil. He looked up, amazed by what appeared to be valuable archaeological findings. Standing before a new door, he declared that they had finally reached the end of the ruins. The priest, turning to his companion, said he was free to explore the place however he wished. And when they carefully opened the door and entered, they saw 2 relics displayed atop a pedestal bathed in light. From afar, the young man now understood that the stories he had read in books were true. Turning to the protagonist, he told the priest he knew he had no right to ask, but he still wished to request a favor. He asked, a bit hesitant, if he could keep that necklace, promising he would repay them generously. With his usual smile, the priest asked what exactly that necklace was. Carmen explained that the object was known as the Lineage Pathfinder and revealed that with just a single drop of blood, it would be able to use the wearer's blood like a needle, pointing in the direction of someone from the same bloodline. The protagonist, closing his eyes for a brief moment, figured he already knew what the boy was hoping for. With a satisfied expression, the expedition leader declared that while it may have been obvious he was searching for his mother, the protagonist listened silently as the young man spoke of seeking a mother he had never known. Then the boy turned to the priest, awaiting confirmation that he could indeed keep the necklace. The priest replied that it was fine and asked in return if he could keep the sword. After leaving that sacred place, they lit a campfire and sat around it, both of them avoiding contact with large blocks of metal, still remembering the recent ordeal they had faced. As he put on the necklace, Carmen commented that if it hadn't been for the priest, the two of them would surely be lost. While he discreetly looked at the protagonist, that priest seemed lost in deep thought. Holding the necklace in his hands, the young man asked the priest if he could bless it. The protagonist, with a serene smile, said yes, that he would be happy to bless it. With a light touch on the boy's finger, he made a small puncture. The boy closed his eyes, and soon after, a drop of blood appeared. He gave thanks as the priest said that the goddess of preservation would protect him. The boy then placed the drop inside the necklace, letting it serve as the pulse point. He watched closely as the drop fell onto the small plate at the center of the necklace. As soon as it happened, it seemed that magic flowed through the entire object, spreading outward. Valtis was visibly pleased, as when he looked at the plate, he noticed that now the necklace resembled a compass whose needle pointed directly toward the direction of his mother. He was certain she was alive. The protagonist expressed his joy in seeing that the necklace worked as promised. Carmen Valtis declared that it was all thanks to the priest and admitted he didn't even know how he would repay such a debt. Looking into the priest's eyes, he revealed that he wished to ask for one more favor. That statement caught the protagonist's attention, and he began observing his friend in silence, waiting for the new request. Valtis revealed that since the two of them were heading west, he hoped the priest would join them in the search for his mother. He believed they could visit the capital, where he could then reward him properly for his support on the journey. The protagonist listened attentively as the young man assured him that he would cover the costs of the trip and smiled. Deep down, the priest wanted to accept, but he knew he couldn't stay near the same person for too long. As he looked at the young man's face lit with hope, he saw that he was waiting for an affirmative answer. However, sitting by the fire, he still remained silent, which made Valtis slightly uncomfortable. The priest smiled subtly. He felt that he could speak to his friend without sounding insincere. Then he stood up, took the young man's hand, and said that if it was all right with him, he would help in the search for his mother. Smiling, the protagonist seemed to radiate light and declared that he would do his best to support the young ones on their journey. A long time passed at the inn, and the redhead thought it was absurd that the priest was leaving just like that. She was furious as the protagonist had only gone to fetch his belongings and was now saying goodbye. Aaron then asked him to give her his hand for a moment. He said that it normally wouldn't be ready so quickly, but he had done his best to finish it. When the protagonist looked at what he was holding, his eyes narrowed. It was the silver mercenary plate. She wanted him to say something meaningful and hoped he would understand what he was supposed to say, but he didn't get it and simply thanked her, which made her even more annoyed. What he should have said was that they would soon be serving together. She told him those words, finishing with a teasing wink. He understood. He closed his eyes and slightly lowered his head, as he wasn't used to returning to the same places. Since he lived a wandering life, he preferred not to retrace his steps as it could limit his freedom. Aaron remarked to Priest Merrick that if he kept living that way, he would never find his soulmate. She said that was why it was up to her to say what needed to be said. He looked at her, hoping to understand better what she meant. Her words were that she would see him again soon. Now that truly confused him. Aaron repeated that they would meet again. And very soon, before he could say anything, she placed her fingers over his lips and said he didn't need to know how. With one final gesture, she placed her finger over her own lips and said that would be her last act before delivering a punishment. Elsewhere, Overdue had gone to visit the Lord and was surprised to see his shiny, bald head. Smiling, the Lord said he had merely reached the true form of human nature. But he quickly changed the subject and asked if the priest was heading to the capital. He then handed him a letter of recommendation. Smiling enigmatically, he admitted he couldn't pay him at the moment, but that letter could help him get out of a tight spot as he had a trusted friend there. He warned, however, that he should only seek that friend as a last resort, as he was difficult to deal with. The priest thanked him sincerely for the gift. Meanwhile, the Lord expressed his happiness in being able to offer it as a gesture of true friendship. He wished the young man a wonderful life, knowing how short life could be. In another region, several footprints were seen in the snow. Two friends walked side by side, moving away from Giz. Smiling, Valtis remarked that they still had about half a day of walking before reaching the next town. The protagonist seemed cheerful, but he knew the mother of corruption still didn't like Carmen Valtis. The only reason she allowed them to travel together was that he was a new ally among the 3.5 Fingers. That alliance could generate 10,000 divinity points, the equivalent of a high authority. Still, he preferred to keep him. The priest walked, watching his cheerful friend ahead, thinking he liked his vibrant personality. While reflecting, he sensed a different energy in the air, so he drew his sword, a peculiar blade with multiple serrations, and called his companion's attention. Valtis, upon seeing the priest with sword in hand, smiled nervously, especially after hearing him say. With a grim look, the priest stated that it was close and positioned the sword in front of his body. He knew something was following them and was getting closer fast. Upon hearing this, Carmen turned sharply. Something really was approaching, and the young man leaped aside, dodging an imminent strike. They were startled to see a massive spider covering much of the sky as it drew near. The monstrous creature landed very close to them, entangled in the branches of a tree. As Carmen asked the protagonist what kind of animal it was, approaching it, he confirmed that it was a snow spider. The now revealed monster was looking for an opening to begin its attack. Seeing this, the young man got ready, drawing his bow and arrows. Herm, looking up, saw that the protagonist already had his sword in hand, striking the enemy. In the next moment, after defeating one of them, more spiders appeared, and he once again stepped forward. With a wild grin, he said to the hand of the goddess that next time he planned to use that sword, he needed to find a place to clean it first, saying this while raising it once more. In the next blow, he struck another advancing spider, further soiling his blade. Not just the sword, but his entire body was now covered in remains of the creatures. Changing scenes, the destruction in the city of Giz was shown. In an improvised location, the lord of that region was receiving an unexpected visitor. The guest, a young woman with blue hair, said that he didn't need to worry. Being direct, he asked what the reason for the surprise visit was, since it was rare for the flame of the blue acceptance to appear without warning. She placed a paper on the table and asked him to take a look. While the lord looked at the paper, she asked if he had ever seen that man before. He, holding the paper, saw a rather poorly drawn sketch, but still recognized the priest. Trying to hide his familiarity with the image, he asked why they were looking for that person. Through the window, the morning sun dominated the view, and the woman said it was a personal matter. She heard the Lord say that no one could identify someone based on that drawing alone. He then said that if that was all, he would suggest she return as he had no time to waste amid the chaos. The young woman seemed to understand, and with that she stood up and left while the Lord simply watched her go. After realizing she had left, he stroked his beard and began thinking about the priest. Meanwhile, Voltus was searching for something inside the spiders, and the priest simply watched that strange act. Smiling as usual, he asked the boy what he was doing. He heard the young man say he was looking for the venom sac from the snow spider, which also piqued his curiosity. Now holding the venom container, the boy said it could be sold for a high price. Still smiling, the priest asked how he knew so much. Carmen told the priest that he had taken part in several monster hunts and had learned a lot from experience. While cutting the parts he needed, he said it was all learned through practice, which he considered very useful. Trying to back away to avoid getting sprayed, the priest said he would try it as well. His companion, covered in grime, said it was about half a day's distance to the nearest city. Elsewhere, the guard were on alert as they spotted something up ahead, and one pointed out to the other. It was true. They were signaling that two people were approaching, and those people were the protagonist and his companion. One of the guards, trying to help, ran until he caught up with the two. Looking somewhat alarmed, he asked how they had managed to get past the city blockade. The protagonist, wearing a confused expression, said they had walked the entire way there. The guard understood, but said the city had been blocked off for at least 3 days due to the monsters. That seemed to interest the priest, so the protagonist asked the guard to explain more about it. The guard revealed that monster attacks had been becoming more frequent lately. Voltus heard the guard say that after the attacks, there were no traces of bodies left behind, which was strange. Everyone knew that snow spiders were monsters that only consumed the blood of their prey. Now, the guards watched the two men and called for their attention. One of them said that the local lord was asking to see them, and another panting confirmed the information. The last guard to arrive said he would accompany them to where the lord was. To the protagonist, it was interesting to learn that the property belonged to a lord. After a while, all of them had bathed and were now standing before a chubby lord. The protagonist said he was already aware of the monster situation. The lord stated that this was the reason he had summoned them to discuss the current events. He said it was all being orchestrated by a worshiper of an evil spirit, but the protagonist thought blocking the entire city was overkill for just one cultist. The lord explained that according to priests, there were at least 4 different cults. In front of a table full of various dishes, the lord explained that these cults were working together. He even teared up as he shared that he had only recently become lord, and that if his father were still alive, he would have resolved the situation. While displaying the many types of food, he thought at least there were still plenty of supplies. The soldiers also still had some morale, so things weren't too bad. At the table, spreading his arms, he said that no one knew what was really happening as the city was isolated. Looking at the protagonist, the lord said he needed someone who could get past the monsters. The lord's expression was full of concern, waiting for their response, especially from the priest. Still silent, the priest closed his eyes as if focusing on something. Then he said that he would help to the best of his ability. Sometime later, He was having a conversation with the hand of the goddess, who was furious. With a magical item in hand, he said that at least they had received it from the investigators of the flow. Using the magical item, he said it could only be found in desert regions. Now, the protagonist was sitting on the edge of the bed alongside the hand of the goddess, his sword, and the enchanted container. He placed the sword inside the magic vessel, just as the goddess had instructed to improve the blade's sharpness. After finishing, he picked up the valuable item and was about to store it away while the hand of the goddess touched his shoulders, rubbing one hand against the other. She said that life was meant to be lived to the fullest. Looking at the item in his inventory, the protagonist seemed satisfied, and the hand of the goddess remained with him. With a crooked smile, he said he had always wanted to say those words. He told the goddess that the real reason he accepted the Lord's request was how strange the situation felt. He had never heard of 4 different sects cooperating. Even though the title of evil spirits sounded intimidating in that game, it didn't mean much. Everyone knew it was a title given by the main gods to other gods. Among all evil spirit worshippers, it was rare to find one mentally stable. Unlike the sects under the main god, which cooperated to combat the evil spirit, the sects that served the spirit rarely acted together. That's why the protagonist, with a cold and suspicious look, believed something strange was going on. With that feeling, he rode out along with the Lord's Guard soldiers. Carmen looked back and noticed something strange, starting to feel worried. When she looked up, her mouth fell open in awe, for there were several monstrous spiders. The priest simply seemed pleased, believing that the time had come. Voltus was startled when the protagonist announced he would ride ahead to draw their attention. Even after hearing from his friend that it was far too dangerous to handle them all alone, the protagonist warned that if they kept going at that pace, they would be caught quickly. Voltus didn't quite understand what he meant, but his eyes remained wide. Letting go of the reins, the protagonist told Carmen to fetch reinforcements and to make sure she brought them. While the others galloped ahead, the protagonist, having dropped the re, was now falling. When his companion saw that Priest Merrick had stayed behind, he simply shouted. Quite pleased, the protagonist told the hand of the goddess that his line had been very impactful. Then a massive explosion sent snow and ice flying in all directions. Hearing it, Valtus gripped the reins tightly and closed his eyes with a sad expression. With the explosion, the other riders looked back. When they did, they saw massive beasts like large mutated wolves. There were also snow spiders in greater numbers, along with snakes and centipedes. But among all those monsters, the most monstrous of all was the protagonist. With a crazed smile, he asked the goddess what she meant when she said his performance was interesting. With a sword in hand, he was ready to saw through all those monstrosities. He was willing to give proper attention to every single one of those little monsters. And for that, he had his saw. While he fought off some monsters, even more kept appearing. But the protagonist pressed on, slashing with his sword at all who crossed his path. He gripped the hilt of that unique sword tightly. With it, he delivered fatal blows to every monster that stood before him. And more snow spiders appeared along with other terrifying monsters. But after striking down all those beasts with his 2 swords, he turned his back and let them fall. With a satisfied expression, he thought that if this happened every day, he should start carrying a bathtub. He thought he should mention it later. For now, he stood before a strange place. He walked thinking he couldn't believe the treatment he was receiving. That place had old wheels and barrels. He looked around and thought he remembered mentioning that the attack carriages had been empty. Walking among them, he noticed a hand near his feet. Bending down to take a closer look, he saw the rest of the body completely dried out, a typical attack from spiders that drained all the blood from a body. Looking up, he couldn't understand why they were enjoying such a good meal. Now he could see they had left the remains as decoration. Personally, he thought it was quite the extravagant decoration. With a light-hearted tone, he told the goddess not to worry, but asked her to keep their guard protected at all times. As he walked, he told her that when it came to humans, he figured that thing could probably eat them. Looking around, he thought there were enough bodies for them to feast on for 3 days. He figured they were raising hatchlings. Still walking with that question on his mind, he saw Antonio up ahead, and he was big. He noticed that from that point on, everything got much larger, as if several giants lived in that region. That made him smile. He figured the divinity that was always trailing behind him should finally show itself. With that, several eyes opened in his direction, and when he looked up, he saw a giant spider even larger than all the others. That one wasn't alone. She seemed to be their queen, the largest of them all, and there were several others. She looked ready to start a fight with the protagonist. At that moment, his eyes turned a deeper green, and he asked the goddess to draw the line of corruption. Immediately, a line of green energy began forming around all the spiders. Still with the green light reflecting on the young man's face, he just smiled subtly. Yun, intimidated, standing face to face with that massive spider. He told the goddess that he would need her authority. When he said that, the beast began to appear to help him, as always, and he confessed that today he would sacrifice himself. Now came the fierce white beast, always attentive to the priest's calls. He told the great beast he would offer her the head of that human-eating spider. He watched the white beast fight the giant spider, and with that, green tattoo-like marks reappeared on his face. He also noticed the beast was at a disadvantage as the spider was stabbing its tentacles into her. That arachnid monster growled and bared its razor-sharp fangs at the beast. The beast roared in pain as all those tentacles pierced into her, and the protagonist noticed the spider was twice the size. And it was extremely furious, still growling and baring its teeth, even drooling. With a sly look, the protagonist thought he needed to find a way to help the giant. So, he started slicing with his special swords, cutting those tentacles and preventing them from attacking the giant. He wanted to free him so he could help more. He could feel that the energy was concentrated inside the spider's body, and he kept cutting, making sure not to damage any part of the spider. Looking with intensely green eyes, he thought there had to be a weaker point somewhere. Looking up from below the spider, he noticed the weak point was now visible. He decided to strike near it, almost splitting the spider in half. Even with all that liquid splattered on his face, he was satisfied now because he understood. He positioned his body for the next attack and noticed the divinity was spread throughout the body. El leaped again to face the spider, intending to cut only the legs to avoid damaging the divinity. While the monster was still fighting, the protagonist told it to run ahead, holding on tightly to something. He said he would help and asked the great beast to make sure the spider wouldn't move. With that, the white beast opened its mouth wide and began growing louder. She grabbed the spider's legs to stop it from moving, just as the protagonist had asked. The arachnid found the sudden movements of the two strange. While the massive beast held the arachnid, the protagonist ran at a perfect angle to strike the ideal spot. He thought that even though it was different, it was still a spider, so he would only cut the skeletal part of its torso. He charged at the weak point and severed the thinnest skeletal section of the body, preserving the rest. As he did this, his gaze intensified in a deep green and extreme malice. Using a powerful strike, he got the reaction he needed. As it was being split, the spider looked at him with confusion. The protagonist had to strike several times, as that part was very dense and difficult to cut. While the beast still held it, he continued attacking the same spot until finally the result he was expecting came. That piece fell apart. Now he had managed to split the spider the right way. He leaped back in front of the light created by the blow when the parts separated. The white beast summoned by the mother of corruption growled so hard that it showed all its teeth, while the protagonist, having struck the ideal spot, landed on the ground. The beast made sure that the severed part didn't fall on him and still held firmly. Its large hands gripped the spider's tentacles, and then she threw the unnecessary piece far away from the protagonist. After everything, the protagonist landed safely, placing one arm on the ground to balance himself. He was a bit startled as he had landed right under the massive beast who was growling and still seemed to hold a grudge. The protagonist knew he had let the beast down the other day, so he apologized for having run away. The wild beast growled, opening her mouth wide and raising her arms. Looking sideways, the protagonist thought the beast still wasn't calm enough. She was still upset, but also upset was the divinity that had been forced to leave the spider's body. She emerged from the destroyed spider's mouth and could only see the protagonist's legs. He, satisfied, pointed to himself and said he knew he was a strange person. That person was very peculiar, with red eyes and several black dots where eyebrows should be. She came out of the spider's mouth as if being spit out, clearly frustrated that her plans had been ruined. She looked at the smiling protagonist who asked her why she had surrounded that city. That beast-like woman asked him why she should tell him anything against her will. While the remains of the giant spider and several others lay on the ground, the protagonist was seen poking at his sword. Looking down from above, he told her it was better to explain why she was surrounding the city. The more that figure refused to speak, the deeper he drove the sword into her arm. That deity even began to drool, yet kept smiling as if not even pain would make her talk. She herself said that not even in death would she reveal something she didn't want to. Smiling, the protagonist said he had already figured that out. And from the panicked look in the deity's eyes, it was obvious what would happen next. With no other option, the protagonist simply separated the deity's head from her body. Now, after that blow, his sword glowed amid the surrounding filth. Upon harvesting that deity, he gained an extra 1,000 in his rewards. He wondered how many more of them needed to be defeated before those evil spirit worshippers would say something. Smirking, he figured he had already done what needed to be done there. A somewhat devilish grin wrapped in green energy. He smiled and said he could eliminate as many as needed. After the protagonist dealt with that deity, he returned. Looking down, he saw the blazing flames and his expression hardened. He couldn't understand how they had already found and set that city on fire. Inside the gates,